This is a country that is in the advanced stages of demographic collapse. And this is going to be the final decade that China can exist as a modern industrialized nation state, because it simply isn't going to have the people to even try.
China's one-child policy is often held up as the pinnacle of what can happen when a government is willing to pair demographic concerns with a complete disregard for individual rights. In a few short years, strict enforcement slashed the birth rate, preventing an estimated 200 million to 400 million births and heading off the overpopulation problem that policymakers so feared. Now, the success of that policy means the end of the Chinese system. There are many legitimate criticisms of one child. Forced abortions, the ability to buy government approval to flaunt the policy, the concept that the government can choose who can reproduce when, a massive sex imbalance in a culture that prefers sons to daughters. All these and more have twisted Chinese culture in awkward and painful directions. But the real problem with one child is that it worked. During the period from 1979 to 2003, when it was strictly enforced, the birth rate dropped by half. That slashed everything from healthcare to education to food costs. But it gutted the most recent generation. After 3 decades of the policy, there has been a European-style hollowing out of the younger segments of the population. This presents China with 3 unavoidable and system-killing problems. First, China is aging far more quickly than it is getting rich. At the beginning of China's international resurgence in 1990, the average Chinese citizen was only 24.9 years old, and the country boasted some 350 million citizens aged 15 to 29. It was this simple circumstance that allowed for China's massive manufacturing boom in the 1990s and 2000s. China was the world's ultimate source of cheap labor, and no other developing country could compete with the Chinese on price. Fast forward to the present, and courtesy of one child, the average Chinese is now 37, just a shade younger than Americans who are currently 37.3 years old. The Chinese will pass the Americans in average age in 2019, and by 2030 will be 42.9 years old versus 39.6 for the Americans. The Chinese call it the 4-2-1 problem. 4 grandparents to 2 parents to 1 child. China is not yet wealthy enough to be able to try to afford a pension system like the advanced democracies, which places the onus of caring for the elderly on their descendants, of whom there are precious few. In terms of relative numbers, the financial cost of the one-child policy is more than double the comparative costs that the Americans face from the boomer retirement. And the Americans already have a social security system in place to absorb some of the cost. The burden of having to financially support their elderly has a catastrophic impact on young workers' professional and financial development, reducing educational opportunities, gutting consumption, and all but making savings impossible. In China's specific situation, not only will this factor alone freeze in place China's efforts to switch its economy from exports to internal consumption and stymie its efforts to move up the value-added scale, but it will also prevent the sort of savings that makes the force-fed finance model possible in the first place. Second, China will never be able to move away from its current export-driven model. Recall what roles each age group carries out in society from an economic point of view. Young workers do the consuming that generates economic growth. The last baby boom that China experienced was in the 1980s, just as one child was picking up. And China has suffered from an intentional baby bust ever since. Those boom babies are now aged 25 to 29 and are very visible as a bulge in China's population pyramid. It may be only a 5-year increment, but it represents about 125 million people. This group's consumption is the primary reason why China appears to be succeeding somewhat in its current efforts to switch from an export-led to a consumption-led economy. But again, courtesy of one child, their successors are ever smaller population cohorts. So congratulations are due to China for having impressive consumption growth in recent years. but that consumption growth has never beat out investment and loan-driven activity and is now nearly played out. Third, so too is the Chinese development model. Simple aging has already reduced China's pool of young, mobile workers by over 40 million during the last decade. And because of the baby bust, that decline is about to accelerate greatly. Put simply, China has run out of surplus labor. Its presence on the low-cost side of global manufacturing has run its course. This is already reflected in Chinese labor costs, which have sextupled since 2002. Looking forward just 25 years, China faces a far darker financial future than Europe and a far darker demographic future than Japan. I normally caution people I speak with about drawing forward linear trends. For example, the idea that China, or before it the Soviet Union or Japan, will soon rule the world. But demography is different. Young workers simply do not magically appear. They have to be born and raised. It takes 20 years to grow a 20-year-old. Well, 20 years and 9 months if you want to be exact. Changing a demography requires a broad-scale shifting of cultural and economic trends, and then holding the change for decades. Simply abolishing one child is only one step of the process. China would then need to encourage the young workers who are crammed into apartment housing to produce multiple children while still working and taking care of their parents and grandparents. It would have to build out an entirely new series of social services in health and childcare, whose absence provided the spare capital that helped make China's manufacturing boom possible. Even if we assume that China can pull this off, and an immediate abolition of the one-child policy leads to an immediate doubling of birth rates, which would be unprecedented in human history, it would still be 2 decades before China would begin to benefit from an expansion of the labor pool in any significant manner. That's 2 decades during which the rest of the Chinese population would still be aging toward retirement. 2 decades during which China won't have much internal consumption going on. 2 decades during which the low-cost, export-led model would still not work.
Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here. It is the 18th of January, and the news from earlier this week is that the Chinese have released a new batch of demographic data, and it is, in a word, atrocious. 2 big pieces of information. First of all, birth rates. In order to maintain your current population, a country needs a birth rate of roughly 2.1 children per woman. With the new data, China is now at 1.16, which is the lowest in their history and the second lowest in human history ever. That's on top of the fact that their biggest cities now have birth rates that are below 0.7, making it impossible for them to maintain their population at all unless they raid the countryside, and China has been raiding the countryside for the last 40 years, and there are now not a lot of people left to pull in. That means, just from this one statistic, China is already the fastest aging society in human history. The second big number is that China's population peaked last year, in fact, with the population dropping by about 800,000 people. The scary thing about both of these figures is that we know they're wrong. A couple years ago, the Chinese started releasing bits and pieces out of their 2020 decade census, and they came to the grudging and public admission that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of those missing millions having been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. So we're talking about exclusively these 100 million people or so are people who would have been aged 40 or under, the folks who have the kids. You combine that with the birth rate information, and we are looking at the complete dissolution of the Chinese demography in a very short period of time. Because if you're losing a lot of people, or you've never had a lot of people under age 40, that suggests that the ability of the Chinese system to maintain a workforce and a tax base is dissolving before our eyes. And we've never seen a system anytime in history that's been able to make it through this sort of transition without a massive, massive, massive change in the political and economic environment. And the possible changes the Chinese are about to experience are not what I would consider things that will make this work better. The problem is that the Chinese model, economic model, is completely dependent upon globalization and internationalization. This is a country that imports 75 to 80% of their oil. This is the world's largest importer of food. This is a country whose oil comes primarily from the Persian Gulf, which is no longer being patrolled by anyone with a navy. And this is a country whose economic model is utterly dependent upon the ability to import raw materials and tech and then export semi-finished and finished goods to other markets that are in a different hemisphere for the most part, or at least a different continent. None of this works unless everyone gets along. And China has seen its economic and political relations with every single trading partner bottom out, with the exception, of course, with the Russians, because there's a shared love of genocide there. So a couple things. First, to a degree, we've always known that this was coming. In addition to the one-child policy, the Chinese have been the fastest urbanizing country in human history. And when you move off the farm and into the city, kids become a bit of a luxury good as opposed to free labor, so everyone has fewer of them. And the fact that urbanization happened at the same time as the one-child policy just crunched down the birth rate even more. We've now seen the birth rate officially, by the numbers that are probably over-optimistic, fall by more than 60% in just the last 6 years. And this is to a degree expected, because when the birth rate is low for long enough, eventually, 30, 40 years on, it cuts into the number of people who are having the children in the first place. So if you have a smaller generation with a much lower birth rate, you get a catastrophically lower birth rate, and that's exactly where we are right now, and this will not get better unless we figure out human cloning at scale. Second is the issue of timing. At the rate of degradation, there will have never been a country we already have never had a country in human history in this sort of situation, but we don't even have an economic theory for how an economy might function if this Chinese data continues on its current path for just another 8 years. So 2030 is probably the use-by date if it doesn't break sooner. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong in the Chinese system. Nothing with agriculture, nothing with trade, nothing with finance, nothing with the Americans, nothing with energy.
Most industries and most subsectors that have decided to relocate to other countries have discovered that they've got shorter, simpler supply chains where there are a lot less of a political headache. Okay, here is the new data. And as you can see that the number of children who are under age 5 has just collapsed. And there are now roughly twice as many that are age 15 as there are age 5. What happened back in 2017, well before COVID, is that we had a sudden collapse in the birth rate, roughly 40% over the next 5 years among the Chinese, the ethnic Han population, and more than 50% among a lot of the minorities. And that is before COVID, which saw anecdotally the birth rate drops considerably more, and before COVID, which probably raised the death rate considerably. We're never going to get good data on death rate, or at least not anytime soon, because the Chinese, when they did the reopening, they just stopped collecting the data on deaths and COVID and everything because they didn't want the world to know how many Chinese died, so they don't know. With this data, this snapshot in time, this is official state data, it's still probably not wildly accurate. We still have the Shanghai Academy of Sciences, which is like the kind of the biggest nerd group you've got in the country, saying that the country has overcounted their population under age 45 by over 100 million people in the aftermath of the one-child policy. And so really what we need to consider is that official data now at the very bottom, you need to play that up. And this last graphic kind of shows you our internal estimate of where that is. Now, this is not official. Those yellow bars probably don't exist, but that is not what the official data is saying. This is an extrapolation from what the Shanghai Academy of Sciences is saying. Anyway, some version of this is probably the truth, which means that China aged past the point of demographic no return over 20 years ago. And it wasn't just this year that India became the world's most populous country. That probably happened roughly a decade ago. And it wasn't in 2018 that the average Chinese aged past the average American. That was probably roughly in 2007 or 2008. So this is not a country that is in demographic decay. This is a country that is in the advanced stages of demographic collapse. And this is going to be the final decade that China can exist as a modern industrialized nation state, because it simply isn't going to have the people to even try. So for those of you who have business in China, you're becoming more and more aware of the political system. You're becoming aware that it's becoming illegal for foreigners to even access data that in most countries is publicly available. You now have on top of that to figure out that not only is the labor force never recovering and the labor costs you're having now are as low as they're ever going to be, consumption is as high as it's ever going to be. So even before you consider the political complications or issues with operating environment or energy access or geopolitical risks or reputational risks, the numbers just aren't there anymore. So you have to ask yourself why you're still there. Sunk cost of industrial plant? That's a reasonable answer. But it becomes less relevant with every passing year as everything else catches up.